Welcome allesamen, the Dutch Vikings. Continuing my series here on the different Vikings and the contact that they had with people of all parts of Europe. Okay, technically, we can't really call them Dutch Vikings, okay? Viking is really just a verb or a profession, of course, as most people know, referring to the Scandinavians who went raiding by sea from the 8th to the 11th centuries. But let me tell you something, the Dutch were Vikings, okay? And back then, they were called the Frisians. And the Frisians deserve to be called Vikings more than anyone else in the world, okay? If we go back far enough in time, they were seafaring traders, raiders, pagans, and overall badasses on par with the Scandinavians of the Viking Age. And in this video, I'm going over the key points in their history of this beautiful people and how the Scandinavians related to them in the Viking Age. And as usual, going all from the sources which are listed below, not just talking out of my ass. So, this video is going to be long. I've divided it into 3 sections that you can all fast forward to if you want to. The first is the Frisians of antiquity, or in the Germanic tribal age as I like to call it. This is a time when we were all one people fighting off the Romans, okay? Then we have the migration era Frisians. Now these are from the hundreds of years of struggle where the tribes were forming into kingdoms basically. And then at the last part of the video I'm speaking about the Viking Age Frisians and how they related to the Scandinavians of the time. So long video, I really wanted to cover everything though because it is so much beautiful history, and I actually did most of the research a while back, but I was inspired to finish and finally film this video now after I'm back from vacation. I had a recent trip to the Netherlands and Belgium. And now, I had been to Amsterdam a few times before in my life, but this trip I really got to see the countryside and the beauty of its nature, the society and the people that's outside of, Amsterdam. I was also in Tomorrowland and I partied my ass off. So yeah, that's in Belgium. I don't know, do you Dutch people consider Belgians Frisian? I don't know, do any Dutch people, if you want to comment down below, do you share some kind of brotherhood or cultural identity with at least the Dutch part of Belgium, would you say? I don't know, you guys tell me. At least historically, for the sake of this video, the region of Belgium there has always been connected to and has been a part of the historical Frisia. So modern day Frisia, or Friesland, is just a small little area there in the Netherlands, but Frisians and their descendants are pretty much all the modern Dutch and those living in this area. They're all a Germanic peoples, like all of these other modern countries here on this map. But if we go back a little more than 2,000 years ago, we all had one religion, we all had the same language, and we were essentially all one genetic group of people and culture, the Germanic tribes. Although we were very, very separated, and we would have probably never admitted to being all one people back then, and we fought like hell, but at least genetically, culturally, linguistically, we were all one. And this is the time we are talking about. So in the oldest sources we have of this area, there are basically 2 tribes that keep coming up that we need to talk about, and that is the Frisiavones and the Frisii. In one passage, Pliny the Elder describes the Frisiavones as an ethnic group separate from the Frisii, so they're 2 separate tribes, and he locates the Frisiavones on the islands of the Rhine, and this area here a little bit south and further inland, along with the Batavian tribe, the Caniefantes tribe, the Chauci, the Sturi, and the Marsaki. In another passage, Pliny the Elder lists the Frisiavones among the Tungri and the Betasi and the Sunuki. As I'm saying all of these tribes because they are probably all kind of interconnected and probably all ancestors of the later Frisians as well. And they all kind of shared this same region living in, which is not very big. So there is some kind of scholarly debate about exactly where the Frisiavones had their homelands, but they seem to be more inland as opposed to the coastal Frisi. Also a big difference, the Frisiavones tribes, they definitely seem to align themselves more with the Romans than the Frisi did. They found 6 Roman military diplomas, in particular from this time period, issued by Roman emperors, basically attributing to the Frisiavones serving in Britain. Now the Frisi, we know a lot more about where their original homelands were at this time, and they were also much more hostile with the Romans. The Frisi lived in the coastal areas stretching roughly from present-day Bremen to Bruges in Belgium. The Roman historian Tacitus even divided the Frisi here into 2 groups, the Greater Frisi and the Lesser Frisi. Pliny the Elder, also writing at this time about 2,000 years ago, said that their lands were forest covered with tall trees growing up to the edge of the lakes, and probably also the oceans and canals and marshlands too. So like the other Germanic peoples, they lived in dense forests. The Frisi, however, lived by agriculture and raising cattle, as opposed to a lot of the other Germanic tribes who were documented to be more focused on hunting and foraging. The Frisi were also known for their elected kings with limited powers and influential military leaders, it says, who led by example rather than authority. And Tacitus spoke about the weakness here of the political hierarchies in reference to the Frisi. Now, according to a Roman, this was a bad thing, because the Romans just loved to appoint some assholes in charge who didn't deserve it and use, bureaucracy to exercise authority over others without question or accountability, okay? That's the Roman view, but in my opinion, and apparently the opinion of all the Germanic peoples, rulers should be elected and they should lead by example. That is much better, and I'll tell you, this idea has still survived today among the Frisi. I think the leaders in the modern Netherlands are the best among the Germanic countries of today. That's just my opinion, though. Either way, I think we can all agree that the Netherlands is one of the most free countries in the world. So these sources are from all around about 2,000 years ago, like I said, but there is one more earlier mention of the Frisi during the Roman wars against the Rhine Germanic tribes and the Chauci, and the Romans here were said to simply pass through Frisi land peacefully in order to attack the Chauci. Now, the Chauci tribe, we have to speak about in this video. Geographically, they were very close to the Frisi, and you Dutch people probably have a lot of Chauci DNA in there. But the Frisi seem to be, at least at this point, more friendly with the Romans, and the Chauci always gave the Rome hell. That did not last long, however. Roman Emperor Drusus placed a moderate tax on the Frisi, and he was a relatively fair leader, but a bit later on, a Roman governor placed a higher tax on them, started to confiscate their land, took their wives and their children into captivity, and in AD 28, the Frisi had had enough of it. They hanged the Roman soldiers collecting the tax and forced the governor to flee, and it ended up with a big battle which the Frisi won. That's one of the best battles in Frisian history, called the Battle of Balduhenna Wood, which we think is near Heilo in modern-day Netherlands. About 10 years later, that's when the Frisi teamed up with the Caniafates and the Chauci tribes to rebel against the Romans. The Romans won that battle, but ever since then, there would never really be Roman rule or control over the Germanic tribes in this area. Over the next 50 to 100 years, there were a ton of wars between the Germanic tribes and Rome, and the Frisi at this point always fought on the side of their Germanic tribal neighbors. Again, this is in contrast to the Frisiavones, who were active participants in the Roman army, and they were basically given their own ethnic unit even. So it is possible that the Frisi and the Frisiavones They were maybe originally one people, but the Frisia Avonis were maybe the traders who gravitated towards Rome and set up their own ethnic group separate from the Frisi. And, I don't know, no sources say anything about that. I'm just saying that's what it looks like. So eventually, as we get into the migration period and the following couple hundred years, tyrannical rule of the Romans and also the invading Huns, and also the climate changes and rising sea levels of the time, it forced the Frisi to migrate away from their homelands, like so many other Germanic tribes did. And the Frisi homelands, most of modern-day Netherlands, was basically underwater for the next couple hundred of years. No one was really living there. Where did they go to in the meantime? We're not quite sure. Some archaeological evidence points to a lot of them going to Flanders and Kent and resettling there for a while. They did return to their homelands, though, once the water levels went down and it was made habitable again in about the 500s. But they were no longer called the Frisi here. They were called the Frisians, and this brings us to our next chapter. The Frisi return to their homelands. Now, most historians on this subject assume that the Frisi of the antiquity are not the same as the Frisians of the Middle Ages after their return to their homeland when the ocean levels dropped again. Some say that they have very little genetic lineage and cultural origins to the Frisi of the tribal Frisi that I just went over. I disagree. Yes, we know that the Frisi migrated all away from this area and spread out into neighboring Germanic kingdoms, and the scholars argue that they mixed in a bunch with the Franks and the Angles and the Saxons and Jutes and so on, but some of them go as far to say that this area was resettled. The original homelands of the Frisi were resettled predominantly by Angles and Saxons, actually. Like the Frisi tribes just integrated with these other tribes and disappeared culturally and genetically. But the historians forget how back then, tribes and ethnic groups stayed with their own people. Even when moving to far, far away places, they still kept their own culture, language, law, and they intermarried with each other for a very long time, even hundreds of years after they had moved away from their homelands. I mean, just one example is the Langobards. They were basically Swedes originally, and they migrated all over. One of the places they ended up in was Rome, and even hundreds of years later, they set up their kingdom and they kept their original culture and laws for themselves, even when they were living right next to Romans in the same cities who followed Roman law. Guys, this is how humans were back then. They had very detailed knowledge about each other's families and lineage. Yeah, sure, sometimes different tribes and kingdoms intermarried with others, but generally they preferred to stay with their own people. We are not even allowed to have these thoughts in our minds today as Europeans because we'll get called racist for thinking this, but I'm just saying this was the reality of ancient peoples everywhere in the world, and it's still the case today in a lot of more kind of tribal or rural communities around the world. I only bring this up because I don't think the Frisians or even the modern day Dutch are that mixed. I don't think they're just Angles and Saxons that migrated back to Frisi territory. I think there's a lot more Frisi tribal ancestry there than the scholars claim, and also the Chauki, like I said, and also these other tribes probably moved back here, like I mentioned. Anyway, fast forward, like I said, the sea levels began to rise in about the 200s or 300s, putting most of the modern Netherlands underwater. Nothing was there, but a couple hundred years later, the water levels dropped, and the area was slowly resettled. But these people weren't called the Frisi anymore, they were called Frisians, and it seems like they had established a territory of Frisia by the mid-500s, at least according to the Old English poem Beowulf. That's not a super accurate source, but it would have been sometime around then, or a little later at least, either way, Frisia slowly expanded, and it was at its greatest height and territory a bit later. It was called Frisia Magna, and by the late 600s, that's when we see the first kingdom and first king being recorded in Frisia. Also, a very important note, there are not a lot of written sources from this early on in the migration period, but one great one is Beowulf. It's not super historical, but is a great source. It's, written later on, speaking about semi-mythological events in the 500s or 600s. We have one battle between a Danish kingdom and the Frisians recorded in Beowulf, but most of the other mentions are purely peaceful, with trade and, cooperation, admiration, and lots of marriages taking place between the royal families in Scandinavia and Frisia. I must say I can relate to this. I have a thing for Dutch girls. This Norseman will take a Frisian maiden any day over a Scandinavian girl. I promise you that. I think Dutch girls are the best ones in the world, but that's my opinion. My girlfriend will get pissed if she sees this, but that's okay. She probably is bored a long time ago. But anyway, I think that today, in the modern day, the Dutch people, Dutch women, and I think Scandinavians 1500 years ago also thought the same thing. What we can also say about this time period in the migration era, Frisia were the absolute masters of sea trade. Not a lot of written records about this, but the archaeological evidence all over the north of Europe suggests that the Frisian sea trade dominated everywhere there. This is what I was talking about at the start of the video. The Frisians were like the Vikings before the Vikings even came around. From about the 500s until the 700s and 800s, the Frisians dominated the North Sea trade, and it all happened from their Frisian center of Dorestad usually. And this was a peaceful time, really, not a whole lot of big wars or bad things going on, just economic growth, trade, and prosperity in the north of Europe, and it was all led by the Frisians. Until, knock knock on the door, trouble comes again. Guess who? It's the Romans. It's the damn Romans again, except this time it was not the Roman Empire, it was the Holy Roman Empire, who was actually, led by the Frankish kings and rulers, mostly at this time period. And they want what all large civilizations want. They want to steal your wealth, your resources, your infrastructure, and they wanted control of the Frisian trade. As usual, the larger civilizations come in and they want power, they want full, unquestionable control, and they want to force their beliefs on others. At this time in history, it was Roman Catholicism, forcing that onto the Frisians, who were still strongly pagan at this time. But this happens at different times in history with different ideas and beliefs. It's not the fault of any religion. The problem is forcing others to believe the things that you want them to believe, and then coming, of course, stealing the goods and what another society broke their backs for, coming around and taking advantage of that. Does any of this sound like something similar to today? Anyway, the Frisians weren't going to give up that easy. As usual, us Germanic tribes are a peaceful people. We don't bother anyone, we keep to ourselves, and everyone is happy. The only time Germanic peoples get violent is when outsiders come in and try to mess with us. So the Frisians stood up for themselves when most places at the time, they just rolled over when the Roman emperor came knocking. And this is what the Frankish-Frisian Wars were all about. Starting in the mid-600s, the Merovingian king Dagobert brought the Frankish Empire together, and they conquered southern Frisia, and they started to Christianize people there. This did not last that long, though. The Frisians took back this area, and less than 20 years later, and then Frisia continued to fight off the ranks by many different means. One of them was a great king called Algisel. He died in the year 680, and then the defense continued with an even greater king named Redbad, who was maybe the most famous Frisian king that you've all heard of. There are even some sources that say Redbad was a Danish king, actually, but those sources are a bit conflicting. So Redbad lost some territory to the Franks in his early years, but he gained it all back in the early 700s. And the Redbad was quite diplomatic, though. He wasn't about fighting all the time. He formed some peace and did some treaties with the Franks, and even married his daughter off to a Frankish mayor to ensure the peace. But one thing that Redbad never budged on was his pagan beliefs, which is why he is one of the greatest heroes in the Dutch pagan community of today. If any of you are in that, you know who Redbad is. He expelled monks and priests out of Frisia, and there's a famous story when Redbad was about to be baptized by a monk, an ex-archbishop. Redbad refused, and he said, "I would rather be in hell with my family than in heaven with my enemies." And there's a pretty good movie about all this. It's not super accurate, though, just a warning there. So Redbad was also the only person to ever defeat the Frankish military leader, Charles Martel. And now I want to remind you guys just how impressive all that is. When I speak about all these old battles with the Germanic tribes, or against the Romans, or the Frisians, or the Vikings, I want you to really grasp how difficult of a task it was winning these battles. This was the entire Frankish Empire fighting against this little region of Frisia, probably being outnumbered 5-1. Just the Romans outnumbered the Germanic tribes 5-1 about 600 years before. It just shows how badass our ancestors were here. So Redbad defended almost every attack, and he was actually planning another invasion into Frankish territory to put an end of all this. He was 70-something years old, and he was still a beast. He still wanted to fight, but he did get sick, and he died before he could do that invasion. Unfortunately, after that, most of Frisia was annexed without even a fight, it seems, from the history books that we have. There was some small resistances, like a very brave king called Puppo, a Frisian king, but his forces were eventually defeated too and forced to Christianize, and they accepted Frankish rule. There was still, until quite late on, a part of East Frisia, though, that managed to remain independent from the Frankish Empire, and they managed to remain pagan for a lot longer, and they were kind of like the rebels aligning themselves with the Saxons in the Saxon Wars, like the last pagans on mainland Europe here, and they were fighting together against the Frankish Empire and Charlemagne, and they raided the hell out of them. They were not big enough to really have a whole army stand up to Charlemagne, but they raided just like the Vikings did, just like I mentioned at the start of the video. See, the Frisians, in the Saxons too, they were doing the Viking shit before the Vikings were doing it. Some of the best ones, quick little stories here. First, they slaughtered Saint Boniface in 754, who forcefully converted pagans and cut down our most sacred tree, Donner's Oak. He destroyed pagan shrines too, but eventually a small band of Frisians caught up to him and slayed him as he deserved. Another one was an uprising of 782 that lasted 3 years. The remaining pagan Frisians teamed up with their brothers in Saxony, and they took back a large part of western Frisia, and the population there quickly returned back to their pagan religion, once Charlemagne wasn't around anymore to kill them for believing in it. There was one more uprising in 793 where the Frisians banished priests and Frankish rule from East Frisia again. It's because they were forcefully recruiting Frisians to fight in a war for them, which they had no business in. And this rising was led by Dukes Uno and Eilrad. Guys, I say these names randomly in the videos because I want to bring these names back, okay? Our old Germanic names are so beautiful, and we can name our children after these great historical people who we descend from. So I would like to see a lot more of these old Frisian names given to children in the Netherlands and Belgium. I think that would be really cool. I'll give you one more very cool story before we move on to the last part. One of the greatest battles in Scandinavian history was the Battle of Bråvellir, which was a big Danish invasion of Sweden, basically, and the Frisians fought in that with the Danes. It's a semi-mythological battle, so we don't know if it did happen or not, but if it did happen, it would have been right around this time in the 700s, just a little bit before the Viking Age. But anyway, that was the last uprising, really, and the last clear examples that we see Frisians Frisians aligning themselves with the pagan Scandinavians. After that, the Frisians were effectively under the control of the Frankish Empire and the Holy Roman Empire, and they accepted Christianity for good. Oh, now why did you guys have to go and do that? We were friends. Us Scandinavians were always friendly with our Frisian brothers. Now you just got Christianized, and now you're going to have to get raided by the Vikings too, just because you did that. This brings us to the final chapter in this video, Frisia in the Viking Age, and what their relations were like with the Scandinavians at the time. So like I just covered, we left off right about the end of the 700s, and this is when the first recorded Viking raids started too. The first one was at 793 in Lindisfarne. And this was the official start of the Viking Age. I'm not going to go into all the history as to why that happened and what were the events leading up to that, because we are speaking about Frisia here. But I will say there are many scholars, me included, that believe the reason for the Viking raids and the reason all this bullshit from the Vikings came about was not because it was a bunch of bloodthirsty Norsemen that just liked raiding everywhere for resources and for fun. But these raids that the Vikings did were actually a retaliation to the Holy Roman Empire and the Franks and their aggressive attempts at Christianizing the north of Europe with these atrocities led by Charlemagne. And the Frisians knew all about this. They experienced it firsthand. The Frisians and the Saxons, when they were converted, many of them would have fled to their brothers in Denmark. They sought refuge and help and religious freedom there, and the Danes and the other Scandinavians, hearing all these horrible things that had been done to their pagan Frisian and Saxon brothers, the Scandinavians got pissed off and launched massive attacks and raids against the Holy Roman Empire and the Franks for the next 200 years. That's what I believe is the kind of igniting force behind the Viking Age. In fact, still today, you will see, even 1200 years later, there is still a decent-sized Frisian population in Denmark. They're assimilated and they're Danes, but they're estimated to be about 5,000 people that kept their Frisian language and culture. Just saying, they could have been there for a very long time and kept their culture for a very long time. Okay, so we all know this history here, how the raids started in the Viking Age, but contrary to popular belief and what you will see in the TV shows and movies, England really did not get raided that bad by the Vikings. The ones who really got the worst of the raids out of all the Europe were the Franks, and especially the ones in Normandy, as you know, but even more so the ones down the Rhine River got the real worst of the raids from the Vikings. I did a whole video about that if you'd like to know that whole story. Along the borders of France, modern Germany area, which is actually where the Frankish and Holy Roman Emperors ruled from previously, and they carried out these atrocities onto the pagans. And this is where the Vikings actually ravaged the most. They massacred that whole area for decades, and they did so from their home base of Dorestad in Frisia, which was, again, one of the main trading ports in the north of Europe and Frisia's #1 town, and the Vikings actually took this over and owned it for a long time. This didn't happen right away, though. It happened a few years after these Frankish attacks. The first Viking, Gottfried, ruled over a part of Frisia as early as the year 810, but it really took about 30 or 40 years for the Vikings to get a strong foothold in Frisia. So the first recorded Viking raid in Frisia is in the year 834. Before then, it seems to be pretty peaceful. You know, the Franks were expanding into Saxony, and we have records of Danish kings involved in peace talks, actually, with the Holy Roman Empire. Even a Danish king called Harald Klok was baptized in the year 826, and he was given land in northeast Frisia to rule over. that all came to a halt. The Danes got pissed off, and they had enough of this Christianizing and baptizing garbage, and they were not going to let any more of that happen in Denmark like it did in Frisia and Saxony and everywhere else just a few decades before. So the Danes ran Harald Klak out of Denmark. They grabbed their balls and basically waged war on Francia for the next 50 years. But this was not all due to the Vikings. Interestingly enough, a grandson of Charlemagne named Lothair, in order to retain power, he basically made a deal and became friends with the Viking kings, Harald the Younger and his brother Rürik. And he actually encouraged them to raid Dorestad to disrupt trade routes, and he eventually gave Dorestad in Frisia to these two Viking brothers. So Frisia was officially under Frankish rule, but kind of a lot of parts of it Viking controlled, Dane controlled. And it was in civil war for the following years for the most part. And make no mistake, the Danes owned Dorestad and also Rüstringen and Valcheren. In effect, they controlled all the economic centers of Frisia for a large part of the 800s. By the year 864, the last raid on Dorestad, or any Frisian area, actually happened from the Danes at least, and from the sources it absolutely seems like the Vikings were calling Frisia home, or at least Dorestad in this area, and using Frisia as a base and being integrated there with people, and then continuing their raids onto Francia, and there wasn't a damn thing the Franks could do to stop them, especially leading up to the winter raids of 881 and 882. The Frankish king Charles III was away in Rome with his best warriors, and when the big Viking armies came, and they took most of the cities in this area without a fight. They razed all these towns to the ground right here and just laid rot pretty much everywhere they went. Even one visit to Köln in modern-day Germany, which was Francia back then, negotiations, Köln paid a large sum of money and silver for the Vikings to leave. The Vikings went raiding further down the river, further inland, and then they came back to Köln to demand more tribute, and they said no, and then the Vikings burned the city to the ground. We have so many stories like this. Again, watch my video I did on all that, because the Franks and this whole area really got raided the worst, and it was mostly led by the Danish king Gottfried. An absolute badass of a man, and he was actually named the Duke of Frisia for a certain point. I think it was about 5 years he ruled over Frisia. And he also used the town of Ghent in Belgium as his base when he was raiding some of the Frankish areas. So there you go, Belgians, there is some Viking power there for you too. And all was going well with the Viking Frisian relations at the time, and also religious freedom in Frisia, because pagans wouldn't have been slaughtered if the Vikings were there in charge. But then, unfortunately, the Danish king Gottfried was murdered in the year 885, and this is one of the reasons, guys, why some scholars believe that the Christianization process of the Frisians was not successful for a long, long time due to the Viking disruptions here. In fact, some believe that there were even two classes of Frisians at the time. There were the Franco-Frisians, who aligned themselves with the Frankish kings and became Christian, and then the Dano-Frisians, who aligned themselves more with the Danes and remained pagan. And again, this is 100 and maybe even 150 years after officially Frisia became Christian. And at this time, when it first started, right, in the Viking Age, remember, this is only 2 or 3 generations since the actions of Charlemagne, so there would have been probably about half Frisians who became strict Christians, and the other half of Frisians would have been pagan still. And they would have been thankful that the Danes were there ruling to keep all that Frankish crap out of there. You're welcome, say the Danes. But of course, none of the history books are going to say this. These are just my thoughts. The history books are all written by Christians. But I think at least that's the most likely scenario based on what we do have written down. Also, a fun source, multiple sources actually. Ubba, one of Ragnar's sons, he was said to be a Duke of Frisia. So we know this for a fact that he was a Duke of Frisia according to these few sources. We also know Björn Ironside was shipwrecked in England one time. He knew he would be in deep trouble if he was caught there, so he traveled to Frisia. He got sick and died in Frisia, but apparently he was friendly enough with Frisia. Of course, maybe his brother was living there, his brother was Duke there, so Björn could have traveled there and he felt comfortable dying there. So the legendary Björn might be buried somewhere in Frisia, although I think we're pretty sure it's in Sweden. At least that's what we are told, but at least he probably died somewhere in Frisia. Alright, just had to open the blinds there. So, towards the mid-Viking Age, we see a much more friendly interaction with Frisia again by the Danes. No more raids recorded, and it seems to be peaceful and pretty friendly. But now you have a bigger problem. It's the damn Norwegians to worry about. We Norwegians don't give a shit. We raided everywhere, and that's exactly what we did to Frisia. And some of the most clear sources about this are the Norse Skaldic Poems that we have records of, and these are some of the oldest written records we have of the Viking Age. The Frisians are mentioned in a battle in the Olavsdropa, which is about Olav Tryggvason that you see here. Another Skaldic poem comes in Heimskringla, where King Olav the Saint went to battle against the Frisians. Both of these Olavs were Christian, by the way, so the Frisians were not even safe against Christian Norwegians. We have another one here documenting the deeds of Knut the Great, who was actually Danish, and also another one in Heimskringla, speaking about the Frisians fighting alongside the Franks and the Saxons and the Wends against Norway and Denmark at the Battle of Danavirki. We whooped all of your asses thanks to the great Norwegian Håkon the Jarl. I've done a few videos on that you can check out. Now, we don't know if that battle is completely historically accurate either, but the point is, by this time, in the late 900s, the Frisians were definitely aligned with the Holy Roman Empire there, and it was really, that meant it was open season on the Frisians for raiding. One of the biggest raiders was our Håkon the Jarl, not this Håkon that you've seen in Vikings, the real Håkon, and he raided the hell out of everywhere, Frisia included. A final Viking that raided the hell out of Frisia was Egil Skallagrimsson, probably the #1 best raider and Viking in general, badass of the whole Viking Age, a mountain of a man from Iceland, from Norwegian stock. And one story tells of his raids in Frisia. He sailed there with his friend Arinbjörn, and they sail up the rivers and the canals into Frisians. The Frisians flee, but they are met with a few hundred warriors, and a single Viking ship of probably only about 50 men fight them off quickly, and Egil's big ass goes out and chases them down into the forest and kills about 50 Frisians all by himself. Egil always did these kinds of things. He's estimated to be a badass of a warrior, a giant more than 2 meters, 7 feet tall, and if even half the stories we have about Egil are true, then he would have been an absolute freak of nature. So, sorry guys, you may have been safe from the Danes in the mid to late Viking Age, but the damn Norwegians, we still came to whoop some ass. But here's a few things that might make you feel a little better. The final sources that I'll go over about the Frisian and Viking kind of contact comes in some Frisian law codes actually, and this paints a more balanced picture. And by the way, we see Vikings referred to in Frisian old texts as these things here, Vitsing. They were also called just Northmen or people of the North, like you see here. Now, most of the law codes referring to the Vikings or the Northmen are referring to what happens if a Viking raid and a kidnapping happens to a Frisian. Like if a Frisian was taken as a slave by the Northmen and they returned to Frisia after they became free, they could do so within 30 years and they would still be entitled to their inherited lands. There's a few laws like that, but let's look at this one, which is very cool. If a Frisian was taken captive and returned to Frisia, and forced to burn down villages and bang women and kill men and do the Viking stuff. The Frisian man would be found not guilty if he could prove that the Northmen forced him to do all of this. Oh, yeah, right. Okay, yeah, sure. Believe that one if you want. just shows that the Frisians, there would have been some willing Frisians who joined in on the Viking raids, unless they could, of course, very easily prove otherwise. Here's another very cool one saying how Frisia used to belong to the north at one point and we were all pagan. One final source, this is the myth of the so-called Noormannen Poortius. I don't know if I'm saying that right in Old Dutch or Old Frisian. The Gates of the Norsemen, which is still told in some parts of Friesland today, in the northern Netherlands, and there are quite a few churches and very old buildings that have small doors facing north, and they've all been shut off. And folk tales say that it's because these doors are related to the Norsemen, and they were a way to let Christian Frisians bow to the north, or bow to the like heathen area of the world, while leaving the church. We don't know why that is or how or where it started, but you can make of that what you will. So that's it. Thank you all for staying to the end of this video. I know it was long. Thank you if you're still here. Guys, the reason I make these videos is for two things. I don't just make them for people's entertainment. History is not there for fun. History is there to learn from. My main goal with this channel and these videos and my whole life is to make the north of Europe proud of our history once again, and ideally this will inspire thousands or even millions of people to look into their own roots, their own culture, their own language and society, way of living and our ancient traditions and way of ruling, and of course our native religion too, which we all shared. If we go back to these things, I think, you know, most of the problems that we're facing in the world today and the things that are going to be coming, if we go back to the old ways, a lot of these things will disappear. And secondly, I make these videos to show that we are all one people. We all have common ancestry and culture if we go back far enough. And I, for one, feel some ancient loyalty to the Frisians, and they're a beautiful people, and I still feel that today after 1,000 years. I would definitely call them brothers, and I think that's just a great way for us to, you know, think about each other and realize that we're all brothers instead of letting the overpowers keep dividing us and things like that. So that's all I have to say for today. Thank you for watching. Hope you enjoyed. Vi ses nästa gång.